Okay, this is the anatomy of type exercise. I'm going to walk you through how to create this illustration here. I've just placed a copy of what we're going to be creating down here at the bottom of my page so you can view it, and I'll walk through how to do this. I'm going to be using Illustrator for this particular diagram. You could also use InDesign, either or. We're really just using text frames, right? And then we're also using lines and circles. And I'll show you a couple of other options, but overall that's all you're using. You're going to find those tools in both applications, Illustrator and or InDesign. So if you're more comfortable in InDesign, feel free to use it, but I'm going to use Illustrator for this just because I want you guys to think about Illustrator as maybe the application for developing any diagrams, any graphics, any major path details that you'd like to create on your own. And then I think of InDesign as the page layout function. So InDesign, you can bring graphics and illustrations into it, you can add type, and you have much more type customization and styles that you can save versus Illustrator. Okay, so that's my spiel on Illustrator versus InDesign. So for Illustrator, we're going to first add our type. So we'll take our type tool, T is the shortcut key, click and drag to create your text box. I'm just going to type the word typography. Then I will Command A to select all. I'm going to find in my properties window on the right side here my character settings. If you have your controls visible, your character settings are also in your control bar at the top of your workspace. And under character, I'm going to find my typefaces. And we're just going to use a standard typeface that we're all pretty familiar with. I'm going to use Times New Roman. Times New Roman. You can see what kind of styles you have available on your system. Mine are just kind of basic. I'll keep it at regular. And then I'm going to increase the type size to give us a nice healthy dimension on the page. Mine's at 90 points, and that's a pretty darn good size. You could make it a little smaller if you wanted to. And you could even center this if you'd like using your paragraph settings. I'll just center this. You do have alignment options. Your alignment icons are small icons that have two rectangles in it. You can usually find the group here at the right side of your controls. You may find it in a small bar on the right side here for alignment. It's also a window where you can find align. Alignment just allows you to align to the page. So when you have your alignment window open, there in the lower right corner is Align To. If you click on that small icon below, you can align to either a selection or to the artboard. So I'm just going to align to the artboard and center this. And you'll notice in Illustrator versus InDesign, it's a little different the way these frames work. So in Illustrator, this text frame that I drew, it's actually more like a path, meaning that if I wanted to change the shape of it, I would have to find the edge with my direct selection tool, and then I can drag that edge up. I'm holding shift while I do this, and I can resize. Whereas in InDesign, when you have a text frame selected, you can resize the whole frame to the type inside of it. Okay, so text frames in Illustrator versus InDesign are very different. So it's more like a path here in Illustrator. Okay, so now that we have our type created, I'm going to open up my layers panel just to help me with navigation a little bit here. And I'll just take my layers panel. I like to keep my layers panel, especially in Illustrator, I keep my layers panel just out so I can see it. It helps me with navigation. Sometimes if paths are overlapping one another, it gets a little hard for me to grab everything just using my artboard. So I do like to be able to see what's going on here. I'm just gonna quickly change some options so I have larger thumbnails. Okay, so I've created my typography, so my text that I'll be adding the diagram to. With my layers window open and my layer 1 expanded, you can expand by clicking on the small arrow next to layer 1. You can see that my typography text is selected. You know you have a selection because you'll see a colored square next to the meatball. I'm actually going to lock this typography shape because I don't want it to keep being selected as I build my diagram. So I'll keep it visible, but I am locking it. And then I'll start building out my diagram. And for the most part, I'll be using text and then, or my type tool, and then I'll be using a line tool. So I'm going to select my line tool. And when I select that, I can see that by default I have a fill swatch filled in with black. I have my stroke swatch filled with none. I'm gonna flip these two. So X will do that, X on your keyboard, or this small double arrow just above your swatches in your toolbar will also allow you to toggle between your fill color and your stroke color. And I'm toggling it because what I want to do is I want to give my line tool a stroke color. So I'll click on my stroke to bring it forward. And if I use my swatches window, I can then choose a new color. I would select something like cyan or pink, basically a color that is going to contrast with the black that we're already using. So I'm going to select magenta or pink. And then I'm going to take my line tool, I'll hold shift while dragging left or right, and I'm going to create a line that sits just below my text. And you can nudge it if it's not perfect, nudge with your up or down arrows on your keyboard. After building the line, you can also see in your properties panel the weight of the line. Mine is a stroke of 1 point. I'll increase that to 2 points. And then just like I did with my word, I'm going to align to center. So I'll use those align icons that are in my control panel right now just to make sure that that line is centered. Looks good. Notice I just put it right where it looks like my lowercase letters are just sitting atop that line. Then I'm going to duplicate this line using my selection tool. V is my shortcut key for a selection tool. And if I start dragging this line while I hold Option, Alt if you have a PC, what I'll get is a duplicate. So Option, click, drag, release, duplicates anything you're working on. If you hold Shift and Option, you'll be able to keep it aligned with your original line. So I'm going to Option, Shift, click, drag, release, and then Option again, hold Shift after you start moving it, and I'm going to have this top line sit atop the capital T, release. Okay, so shortcut key, Option or Alt for duplication, Shift to keep it aligned. Okay, so notice my lines are perfect. They just line up. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to nudge anything into place. And now we're going to describe what we're looking at here. So the bottom line that we created at the beginning, that's actually something called our baseline. And I just, to save us a little bit of time, I sort of adjusted. I copied my labels that I'll be using. So baseline is here. I'll just copy this. And I'll move this off my artboard so it's not in the way. Okay, and then what I'll do is I'll take my type tool, create a little text frame, and just Command V right into this. I'm going to make sure that this text is also magenta to match my lines. So select the text after you've pasted it in there. Make sure the fill swatch is forward in your swatches window. To bring something forward, you just click on it one time. So you want that fill swatch in the foreground, and then I'll select the magenta color. Again, just making it exactly the same as the same color as your lines. And then I'm going to use my paragraph settings. You can find those in your properties on the right. You can find it in your controls a little further to the right here. And I'm just going to align my my text, my type, to the right side of this text frame that I've created. And again, in InDesign, if you're using text frames, you have a lot more options for customizing, alignment, and things like that. Not as simple as in Illustrator. So I'm just going to align it to the right and then nudge it so it looks like it's basically aligned to the baseline that we built. That looks good. Now that I have that text built, I'll Option, click, drag, release to make a duplicate. And I'll rename this new line. This is something called X height. X height is the height of these basic shapes for lowercase letters. Now, when we look at lowercase letters here for this word typography, most of them align, the top aligns to this X height. Not all. Notice H is lowercase, but it has a stroke that is called an ascender, which means it goes above that X height. But in general, you can think of X height as basically the height of the lowercase letter forms, right? Even H has a form in here, a stroke in here that aligns to that X height. Notice with Times New Roman, our X height is actually pretty tall. And by tall, I mean it's taller than halfway. If I look at my baseline and then this third line, which is going to be called our cap height, if I look at those two and split them in half, I would actually, just to give you an idea, I would actually find that about halfway is pretty significant from what the X height is. So the X height is about a third more height in this Times New Roman typeface than center, okay? If that makes any sense. If it doesn't make sense, it's okay. But it means that it's the lowercase letters are a bit taller in comparison to the cap height, and what that means is that they're most likely more legible or easy to read. And just something to keep in mind if you're using a typeface and you're trying to figure out conceptually why it's difficult to read, you might be dealing with an X height that's too short. Try to find a typeface that has an X height that's a little taller. What that's going to give you are letters that are a bit wider and then also rounder usually, and that increases legibility. Okay, so sometimes when we're learning typography, we don't always know why something's happening, but there are some rules in typography that will help you. So X height's one of them. Okay, so we have our two layers for baseline and X height. I'm going to Option, click, drag, release one more time. Again, you can hold Shift to keep this aligned. And this is cap height. So I'll just type that out. And notice how nice it is to have just duplicated and holding Shift. All of these are nice and lined up. They're the right color. If I'm not happy with where they're located, I can just select all three and just nudge them down using my up and down arrows. Okay. So these look pretty good. I think they looked better when they're just kind of lined up with the lines. You can bring these as close as you want to these lines as long as you can still read them. Okay, so cap height is just what you think. It's what the capital letters are aligned to visually. Notice H is almost aligned to the cap height, just a slight overset here, but it looks good. Remember that baseline X height and cap height, while they exist after we've added them here, they are invisible when you actually look at a typeface. So technically, they don't really exist in a typeface, but our eyes create them as we look at the letter forms. And so it's something that you can use when you're designing your own type. Okay, so we have now defined already 3 terms. So I'm just going to delete those terms from my list over here, just to keep us on track. Okay. All right, so the next thing that we're going to be labeling is the arm. And you can also change this. The arm goes to the T, so then you can lengthen this by using your direct selection tool. And also with lines, know that you can also change the arrow. So if I open up my stroke window by clicking on stroke and properties, I'll get my stroke window here, and arrowheads can be added. Okay, now you might have to experiment with which arrows are going to work for you, but arrows are available in your stroke window down here at the bottom. Okay, and you can kind of toy with those. The arrows get pretty significant if your stroke increases or decreases, so you might have to, again, sort of explore what works best for you. Okay, so we have the arm. Let's define the serif, because I believe that's next. Yep, serif, and then we'll do the bowl and the counter. Okay, serifs are a Latin word for feet. So we have lots of feet in this typeface. We'll just choose to illustrate maybe 1 or 2 serifs. I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to select this little serif at the top of my Y, but I will mention this is a serif. These are serifs on the R. Serif. Serif. Okay, all of these are considered serifs. They look like little feet, and typefaces that have these extensions at the end of their stroke are serifed typefaces. Okay, I'm not going to label all of the serifs, but we'll just label a couple so that we can use them. Okay, so again, just to save time, I'm going to duplicate this arrow that I just created for arm. I'm going to duplicate the text frame, and I'll name this serif. Duplicate that. Again, to duplicate, Option or Alt, and then for my arrows, if you need to rotate anything, R. In Illustrator, R will rotate, and a nifty trick for R, as you rotate, hold Shift, and it will lock into 45-degree angles. So I basically always hold Shift when rotating. If you don't like the arrows, you can always turn them off, so you can select that line, reopen that stroke setting, and just change your arrow to none, and it'll look like that. So it's totally up to you. So now what we'll do is we'll label the bowls. Bowls are in several letters, but we're going to focus on the O here. I do want you to know that bowls are in this P, and sometimes certain types of A's have bowls. I would not necessarily call this a bowl. Some people might, but there are A's that actually are more circular, that do not have this extra stroke above it. Okay, and they would also be considered a bowl. Okay, so bowls are usually round, somewhat symmetric spaces inside that are enclosed in a letter form. But O is the easiest one to illustrate a bowl. Okay, just duplicating my words here and just aligning them. So that circular shape of the O is the entire bowl. Okay, so it's the whole shape. And then there's a couple of things happening inside of here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom into the O, and I'm going to show you guys what an axis is. So there's an axis inside of this O, and the axis essentially dissects the bowl's shape. Okay, my axis is not vertical. If it is completely vertical, it would not be bisecting the shape. Okay, the axis is more angular. It's usually connecting the two thinnest parts of the stroke around your O. Okay, so if we look at this, this is a round stroke. If we think of this as penmanship, right, where the thickness of like a marker or a pen changes as you navigate around the form. So we're looking for the thinnest part of the O on each side, and that's really where your axis lives. Okay, so that's what the axis is. It basically bisects and connects those two thinnest parts of your stroke. About at that, that's pretty good. Trying to get it as close as possible. I think that's a good axis. Okay, so that's what an axis is, and I'm just going to take my selection tool, duplicate this by using Option, Alt on a PC, and I'm actually going to use a new type tool in Illustrator, the Type on a Path tool. So if you just hold your mouse down over the type tool, you'll get the menu. And I'll click directly onto this path and then type the word. Axis. Oh, this is interesting. It's not letting me type it. Oh, for some reason. Oh, I see. So notice what's happening on my page here. My type, I had forgotten that the last type that I added with my type tool was this typography. So it's very large. So what I'll do is I'll bring this back down to just kind of a regular size here. Okay, I was wondering why I wasn't seeing my text. That explains it. Okay, so if that happens to you, don't panic. It's just, it's pulling from your previous. So you'll have to resize the size of your type using your character settings. And then notice when I do resize it, it looks good now, but I'm getting these three kind of, they look horizontal, but they're actually vertical lines because they're coming away from this path that I created earlier. And what these are start and end points. Okay, so a start point, which is where my A is, a midpoint, and then an end point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this start point and I'm just going to see if I can drag it the end of my path, and I can. Okay, perfect. Okay, and then I'll just select this, highlight it, use my swatches panel to change the color, and then also, actually I can just use my eyedropper tool to apply the typeface. Okay, so that's an axis. You might have to make this a little bit smaller just because it's kind of inside of that shape and it can feel crowded. Okay, so that's the axis. And again, I'm a sucker for my eyedropper tool, love using it. I for eyedropper. I move a lot between my selection tool and any other tools. I'm constantly pressing V to access my selection tool because a lot of times I build things and then I just want to move them around. And the selection tool is the easiest way to do that. Okay, so we have our bowl, we've defined our axis, and then we'll talk about a counter. Now, counters are everywhere. The O has a counter, the P has a counter, the A has a counter. Counters are shapes that create our letters, but they're the shapes that aren't black. If we look at a black typeface like this, okay? They're the open spaces. So we can define a counter a number of ways. I'll just duplicate this line, press A, and I can select this and drag it up. So V and A is the direct selection tool. You can just, it allows you to select an individual anchor point, move it around, or parts of a path to move. Okay. V will select the whole object. So I like to use V when I'm duplicating things. So V, Option or Alt, click, drag, release. Call this a counter. Okay, so the counter is this white space. Okay, this white space inside of the letter. And if you want to get a little bit better with your diagramming, what you can do is maybe take something like the pen tool, or even take an ellipse and resize it. Okay, I'm just going to make a closed shape here, and I will add a little bit of opacity using my transparency window. And then move this behind my letter. So this is a little trick. If you wanted to get a little more fancy with your diagrams, you could start thinking about how you can highlight an area without making it feel crowded. So the arrow is helpful, but it's not really explaining the counter shape. But when I color in that counter shape, that makes it a lot clearer. So I just built, it's not pretty, it ain't perfect. I just built this shape and I sent it to the back. So to send something all the way to the back, Command Shift left bracket or Control Shift left bracket if you're on a PC. But you can always find it in your object menu, Arrange, Send to Back, and it will send it all the way to the back of the layer that you're working on. So I just sent it to the back so that you don't really see the edges, you just see that fill color behind your letter. Okay, so that's a counter. Other counters would be this white shape here in the P, this white shape here inside of the A. Notice what I mean when I say it's a shape inside of a letter, right? So without these shapes, you really wouldn't have the same kind of letter form. Okay, so you actually need that white shape along with the black strokes in order to have an actual letter. Okay, all right, let's label the ear, which is this funny little shape off of our G. I'm going to make this much shorter. gonna label my terminal. Again, I'm just duplicating here, getting really used to just duplicating, relabeling. So I'm gonna place a terminal here. This terminal is this funny stroke that is only found on the R. The ear is only found on this, we call it a double story G. Okay? Not every typeface has a double story G. Okay? Terminal is actually, yeah, it's this little shape on the R. And then we have loop, ascender, and descender. So a loop is really easy to define. I'm going to duplicate this, press R, and rotate it. This lower story on our G is a loop. Again, I'm just duplicating these things and then using my selection tool to move it into place so it looks good. And then ascenders and descenders. You can use your line tool or you can use your pen tool. It's up to you. Sometimes I like using my pen tool because it's a little bit faster. So I'll just point to the P and the Y here. I just hold shift while I'm drawing something like this and it sort of locks into place. Command Shift A will deselect so you're no longer on your shape. Notice when I just built with my pen tool this shape with this open side, it has a pink fill. If I toggle, I can flip that to just be a stroke. Toggling, X will toggle. And then I'll increase my stroke again. I can even add arrows. If I want an arrow. Now, you don't always need to have arrows. Sometimes lines are perfect without an arrow. Take my selection tool, duplicate my word, and again, just a reminder, if you're an Illustrator, oops, and you want to change this frame, you sort of have to grab your anchor points and your sides and resize them. So that's kind of the downside of Illustrator. It's not as nice, it's not as friendly as InDesign is as far as really laying out your text. Okay, and then I'm going to call this a descender. Actually, I made it a little too short. Let's type out descender first. I'll take my direct selection tool here just to shorten this text frame, and I'll show you why. I'm going to click on each corner, hold shift, and then just drag this side in. So I'm also holding shift while I drag to keep this lined up. And then I'll add I don't know why my frame's not, there we go. Okay, so there is something going on with my text frame. I think I need to look at my layer and figure out where this is located. Okay, so my descender right now is sort of, because I've been duplicating these a lot, they're kind of in the background. I might need to bring this forward. So I'm going to arrange, bring to front. There we go. So I've taken this text box that it's in and I filled it with white. Now, in Illustrator, if you want the box that the text is inside of, the path that the text is inside of, you have to select it. So I use my direct selection tool for that. That's your white arrow. just to make sure that the box is selected, not my text. And then I added a white fill. So I brought my fill swatch forward by clicking on it, clicked on the white swatch, and there we go. And if I wanted to make any adjustments to this, I would use my direct selection tool to click on each side and do that. And you can also, while you're here, you can make sure that that text is nice and centered. So I'm just doing that to make it look like there are two arrows around my word for descender. Notice what I'm calling a descender here. Descenders are letters that drop below the baseline. Sometimes even capital letters will descend, but usually it's what we're dealing with lowercase letters. I'll just adjust this. Okay, so now that I have these arrows in place, I'm pretty happy with them. I'm just going to copy the arrow shape, selecting it with my selection tool, Command C, Command V, R to rotate. Actually, I guess I don't need this exact arrow. If you want to delete a part of it, just take your direct selection tool, delete. Oh, I'm sorry. I can delete this, and then I can delete this. Okay, and then I can change my arrows. Again, you don't always have to keep the arrows. You can go into your stroke settings and make changes. We're going to add the label for ascender. And ascender is just a lowercase letter that goes above that X height. It ascends. Okay, so ascender, we have descenders, we have our loop, terminal. Oh, the one thing we have forgotten, we forgot the tail. So let's add a tail down here. I'm just going to, again, take my selection tool, make a duplicate this, double click, oops, sorry. By the way, if you ever double click too quickly and that happens where you end up inside of kind of this gray space, you're in something called isolation mode. It's not difficult to get out of. Just double click in a blank area of your artboard. It'll take you right out of there. Okay, so that is a really quick diagram. And as I zoom in, we can kind of see what's going on here. Now, if you don't want your lines in the way, you can select all of these. Just hold Shift, click one time on each of them with your selection tool. So basically I have all three lines selected, and I can arrange them by sending them to the back. Again, using that object menu. And what that will do is it'll make it where all your letters are sort of in the front and those lines are in the back. And you could also toy if you wanted those to be a little less intrusive. You could even go again to that transparency window. Remember, if you can't find a window, all windows are under your window menu. Okay, and these are arranged in alphabetical order. So if you're looking for your transparency menu or transparency window, you're going to find it right here. So don't panic if you don't have the exact same windows as me. Just know any window is going to be available in your Windows menu. But under transparency, you have this opacity slider, and you could lighten these lines up a little bit if you wanted to. That would be totally up to you. I don't really think it matters that much for this particular exercise, but just to remind you that there are different ways to approach a really simple diagram. Okay, so this looks pretty good. I'm going to zoom out here so you can see the whole page. Loop, axis, descenders, we've done them all. This is great. Okay, so that is your first diagram. So what you're going to do on your own is you're going to create a second diagram, and I've created a second artboard here. And your second diagram is going to use a different typeface, so not Times New Roman, and it's going to be a different word. It can be any word you choose. I have seen it all. The word could be your name. The word could be your, I don't know, favorite color. Any word you want. But it's up to you, right? Whatever word you choose, and then choose a typeface, right? If you want a veneer, Roboto is kind of fun. All sorts of different typefaces, right? It does not matter. Choose a typeface on your system, and then what you're going to do is you're going to take all of these labels and apply them to your new word. So you're going to recreate the diagram I just walked you through, but this time you're going to discover that you will not be able to label all of these. So for instance, if I stuck to this word freedom, I will not be able to label descender. So what I'm going to have to do, if I can't find one or more of these terms in my word and typeface, I'm going to have to discover a new one. So I'll have to open up Google, look for typography terminology, and add a different label. So I still could label a sender for this D. I could still label my cap, my X, my baseline. There are counters. I have a terminal because I have an R. I don't have a loop, so I'd have to find a new term to illustrate that isn't loop. Okay, so anything from this original list that you can't find, you'll have to replace it with something new. And then I'm going to ask that you find 3 additional new terms and illustrate them here in a diagram. And your diagram can look slightly different from mine. You might choose to point to things in a different way. Maybe your lines look different. Maybe you don't use arrows. Maybe more often you're simply using circles to highlight something. Maybe you're using color in an interesting way, or even scale, okay? I've seen lots of unique solutions here, but I'm asking you to create your own diagram with your own chosen word, and then you'll save both of these. Save it as a 2-page PDF, okay? And just to give you an idea, in Illustrator, to save as a PDF, you just do save as or save a copy. Illustrator and PDF are very compatible, okay? So it's just save as, change your format to PDF, and make sure that it's exporting both pages. Okay, so that is your exercise, and hopefully all the creative solutions you come up with for diagrams can apply to the typography poster that you're going to have to create.